In this pod-slice summary of the Wild project between Jordi Wild and David Jimenez, where they delve into several topics broadly centered around literature, global affairs, journalism, and the evolving nature of traditional and newer forms of media like podcasts. One key discussion point revolves around Jordi's renewed interest in reading, sparked partly by the podcast and its varied guests. One of the recent reads being Los Diarios del Opio. This leads to a discussion revolving around the book, which presents real stories from prominent figures in a peculiar spot where opium is widespread. David Jimenez, a repeat guest on the podcast, shares his excitement about the impact his first appearance had, boasting the increased sale of his book and the surreal recognition he gets on the streets. This segues into a discussion about the merging of old-school journalism with newer media forms, referencing Jordi's wide influence, especially among younger audiences. A substantial section of the conversation focuses on the Israel-Palestine conflict. David presents a historical background beginning in the late 40s, explaining how it originated post-Holocaust due to the creation of a Jewish state in a region already populated. This led to decades of strife, hostilities, and territorial disputes, further hardened by religious beliefs and past injustices. The difficulty in attaining a two-state solution and the unfortunate humanitarian crisis in Gaza are discussed in depth, painting a grim picture of the conflict's current state. David also takes the time to distinguish between terrorism and non-terrorism, labeling attacks against civilians as sheer acts of terror, regardless of who carries them out. He criticizes the political manipulation where leaders distance themselves from the front lines of conflict, putting innocent lives at risk. Towards the end of the conversation, the host and guest steer towards the current situation in Ukraine, discussing the notable roles key figures like Zelensky play amidst the conflict. The discussion rounds off with brief mentions of other international affairs, including the behavior of Russian forces and the ruthless DPRK regime under the Kim family. Through the conversation, the dynamic of changing media forms, a significant global conflict, and the evolving nature of journalism are extensively unpacked, providing a comprehensive overview of these complex, interconnected subjects. The extended and intense dialogue between host Jordi Wild and guest David Jimenez moves between various areas of conflict and examines the roles of international actors and governing bodies. The conversation delves into the brutal regimes ruling states such as Iran, China, and Myanmar, and dwells deeply on the volatility of endangered democracies juxtaposed to resurgently authoritarian regimes worldwide. Speaking on Myanmar, they discuss how military rule has successfully established itself and brutally put down 3 attempts to re-establish a democratic government. By employing ruthless tactics, including indiscriminate firing upon innocent civilians, regimes like these continually assert their control and make it extremely difficult for any internal or external forces to oust them from power. Honing in on Russia, David and Jordi reflect on Putin's ruthlessness, highlighting the mobilization of specialized intelligence teams to exterminate his opponents effectively. They explore the extreme dangers journalists face in the country, each reporting act making them targets of possibly life-threatening attacks. On Israel, the guest provides an enlightening perspective, asserting that upcoming retaliations against recent Palestinian attacks might be extensive and permanently devastating in nature, leading to a foreseeable increase of tensions in the region. They analyze the potential involvement of other Arab countries and the extent to which they would tolerate the continued massacre of Gaza inhabitants. In the transient landscape of international politics, allegiances may change rapidly. A prime example is the United States, currently considered somewhat weak, unclear, and inconsistent in terms of its stance on world affairs. In the context of an escalating global crisis, China proves instrumental in tipping the balance of power, either toward or away from a large-scale conflict. Jimenez highlights the world is on thin ice, with the Taiwan issue potentially catalyzing a third world war. They also ponder the approaching takeover of Saudi Arabia in the football world, as the oil-wealthy nation negotiates lucrative deals with top players and organizations, resulting in a troubling silencing of criticism against human rights abuses prevalent in the kingdom. David underscores that the world is at a moral crossroads, where, bereft of strong leadership, societies may be swayed by economic interests more than ethical demands. The only antidote against this drifting moral compass, he suggests, is moral courage. The guts to stand up for what's right, even in adverse circumstances. The hosts urge their audience to develop a nuanced understanding of these global issues and retain their deep-rooted humanity amid such turmoil. In this elaborate discourse between host Jordi Wild and guest David Jimenez, conversation shifts towards discussing the unsustainability of incessant growth, where each generation aspires to surpass its predecessor's quality of life. Jimenez notes the need for a profound understanding of sustainable development and the adverse socio-economic impact climate change can trigger worldwide, as an example. They discuss Ethiopia, a country struggling to provide its youth with growth opportunities, making it a tinderbox with a young and frustrated population. They question the long-standing global inequality, where crossing the 14-kilometer space between Africa and Europe can mean the difference between survival and death for many, fostering violent conflict. The conversation veers towards China, where Jiménez narrates the experience of getting banned from entering due to his unapologetically truthful reporting of the government's brutality, despite his admiration for the resilience and fortitude of the Chinese people. He further highlights the ambitions of Xi Jinping to unify China, including Taiwan, which could potentially push the world to the brink of a large-scale conflict. Analyzing Taiwan's predicament, they note the crucial role the US and Europe will play, implying the importance of making strategic choices that ensure Taiwan's safety. Switching gears, they discuss the political landscape in the US, weighing the repercussions of a potential Trump win in the next election versus President Biden. David refers to Trump as a potentially dangerous leader and finds the choice between the two worrisome, indicative of the polarized and irrational state of world politics. In their discourse, an essential point highlighted is the value of independent thinking. Encouraging listeners not to lock themselves within ideological echo chambers, they underscore the necessity for critical thought and informed decisions based on comprehensive, unbiased data. Evolving towards discussing dictatorship and journalistic freedom, David shares his experiences and challenges, illuminating the array of risks journalists face, especially when exposing autocratic regimes. He stresses the need for journalistic courage, a vigorous commitment to truth-telling, regardless of the opposition or danger faced. His personal anecdotes underline the risks he's taken to provide a voice to the silenced, emphasizing the journalist's responsibility to report the truth. They touch upon China's impressive growth over the years and discuss the crucial role it plays in shaping global politics. However, they foresee increasing global resistance to China's expansionist ambitions, suggesting continuous conflict unless the country restrains its aggressive territorial pursuits. The conversation rounds back to America, discussing potential future elections and bleakly weighing the options of a dead Biden versus a zombie Trump. The hosts speculate on possible election outcomes and the global impact, highlighting the significance of the American political landscape in dictating international relations. Their discussion finally tackles world power's fascination with warfare, the detrimental consequences faced by countries embroiled in conflicts, and the historic track record of failed territorial conquests. They argue that holding a country against its will proves a failed strategy, often leading to protracted wars with no clear victory, a stark warning for prevailing global superpowers. Throughout this wide-ranging conversation, Jordi and David continuously urge listeners to think critically, question established narratives, and understand the volatile global political backdrop with an open mind. They stress the importance of resisting dangerous partisan ideologies and advocating for peace and diplomacy over conflict and turmoil. In this intricate exchange between Jordi Wild and David Jimenez, a broader social discourse is shaped, highlighting the critical role of journalism in contemporary society. Jimenez insists on the value and credibility of information source, given the manipulation and dissemination of untruths through modern technological channels like social networks and artificial intelligence systems. He voices his apprehensions that deception seems to be taking the upper hand, and its triumph can lead to the legitimization of corrupted, deceitful leaders, fostering and maintaining dictatorships and fueling genocides, citing an impactful case in Burma from 2016. Jimenez stresses the enormity of damage misinformation can cause, making truthful reporting crucial. He also criticizes media outlets favoring partisanship, which leads to the replication of biased information. He advises journalism students emphasizing the importance of adhering to principles and delivering truth for the sake of citizens, which can sometimes mean bringing up undesirable realities. They further touch on the trend of propaganda-fueled journalism, which can potentially destroy democracies. Jimenez cites the correlation between an international disorder and the negligence towards the importance of truth. He advocates for valuing truth even when uncomfortable, emphasizing the journalist's role in proposing opposing viewpoints and inconvenient truths. The dialogue then weaves into the intrigues and complexities of international conflicts. Commenting on Israel's strategy and its advanced military prowess, they sift through potential theories around the recent attacks within Israel's borders, raising questions on the ease of how these infiltrations took place, despite being supposedly one of the most prepared and technologically advanced armies in the world. Jimenez asserts the significance of evidence and keen journalistic investigation into such events, expressing skepticism towards conspiracy theories until proven otherwise. He narrates experiences from his journalistic career, emphasizing the necessity of handling unreliable information with caution. He also speaks to the risk and challenges of war correspondents reporting from hostile zones, asserting their dedication to presenting the truth rather than appeasing narratives propagated by the influential. Jiménez reiterates the role and purpose of journalism, to confront power with challenging questions and not to placate those in influential positions. In this part of the conversation, Jiménez shares an intimate experience of interviewing Dalai Lama, recounting the spiritual leader's acceptance of same-sex marriage and disclosing his personal struggles with erotic dreams. Experiencing the humility the Dalai Lama possesses, despite being considered a god by his followers, Jiménez applauds the authenticity and sincerity, suggesting political leaders can learn from this. He also shares his shock and disappointment towards the controversial kissing incident, but also expressed understanding it may be part of Tibetan culture. Jiménez then draws attention back to the state of democracy in Spain and other Western countries. While acknowledging the freedom and safety to criticize political leaders in these countries compared to autocratic regimes like North Korea or Russia, he warns against complacency. According to him, the democratic deterioration in such Western countries can be reversed by well-informed citizens who aren't ideologically biased, able to criticize their own political leaders, and advocate for laws that maintain independence and neutrality in major institutions. Furthermore, he criticizes the partisanship in political institutions and its detrimental effects on democracy. Jiménez strongly advocates for accountable politicians who prioritize the improvement of their citizens' lives over maintaining power. He further criticizes the practice of voting in the blank, considering it equivalent to denying one's democratic power. However, he admits engaging in the practice himself due to his disappointment with current politicians, asserting that he won't vote until a politician convinces him of their dedication to improving democracy, regardless of their political leanings. Towards the end, Jiménez critiques some of the prominent Spanish politicians, Pedro Sánchez, Susana Díaz, Vasca, and Feijóo, reflecting on their failures to live up to the ideals of democracy. He terms the state of Spanish politics as a triumph of mediocrity, with prevalent fraudulent practices and terrorist activities, a throwback to the tenure of Felipe González, painting a grim picture of a decaying political landscape. This detailed recounting of the political scene in Spain offers a stark reminder of the need for meaningful and transformative political reform. Jiménez maintains his critical stance towards political behaviors, condemning their tendency to prioritize maintaining power over the integrity of the nation. He scrutinizes individual Spanish politicians, accusing them of having few moral qualms as long as they remain in power. An example pointed out was the appointment of the Minister of Justice as the State Attorney General, diminishing judicial independence. He criticizes party-based policymaking, claiming it is more beneficial for the parties than the citizens. Linking this to Spain's relationship with the EU, Jiménez highlights how Spanish policies have mostly been supervised by Brussels. And the crucial factor is not political inclination, but the politician's principles, morality, and prioritization of the public interest. Upon reflecting on Spain's political scene, he argues the concept of political rewards. Party loyalty, in his opinion, has led to the spreading of fear, discouraging open expression, and subverting independent judgment. This has contributed to the rise of a corrupt culture and the decay of the nation. Jiménez paints a bleak picture of the Spanish political scene, describing the parliament as a playground filled with mediocre intellectual and cultural discourse. This resonates with his earlier sentiment of politics being a triumph of mediocrity. While acknowledging the flaws of the current system, he does not advocate for non-voting in protest. Despite expressing his disappointment with current politicians, he underlines voting as a fundamental democratic power that should not be given up lightly. Wrapping up his critique, Jiménez touches on the topic of amnesty, particularly concerning Catalonia's independence movement. He calls possible amnesty as a commercial exchange for votes and raises concerns about the legal and ethical implications of this. Shifting from politics, he draws attention to the societal and cultural behaviors in Spain. His storytelling paints a vivid comparison between Spanish and Japanese cultures, arguing that deep-seated changes are required for Spain to transform, with education as the key. His critique extends to the perceived culture of cheating in Spain, viewing it as a significant impediment to societal advancement and a source of decay in various public sectors. Furthermore, he defines this culture of dishonesty as something that hinders a society from moving towards meritocracy. In this part of the discussion, Jiménez extends his critique to the world of football, drawing parallels between political corruption and unethical behaviors pervading the sports realm. He mentions the controversial relationship between football clubs and referees, especially pointing out a case involving Barcelona's financial links to the vice president of referees. This, he suggests, could lead to biased decision-making and foul play. Moreover, Jimenez criticizes the opaque transfer market system and the exploitation of young players recruited from Africa. He regards this as another facet of widespread corruption in the football industry. Adding to this, he is dismayed about how prestigious tournaments like the Super Cup are held in countries with human rights abuses like Saudi Arabia, arguing that it amounts to whitewashing such regimes' appalling reputations. In his narrative, the unchecked corruption within football deeply disturbs Jimenez. He rues that even sports, which should ideally promote meritocracy and honest competition, are plagued by unethical practices and scandals. He is particularly disheartened seeing the passion for football among young fans being met with a reality of corruption, money laundering and image manipulation in clubs. Jimenez hits out at football stars like Ronaldo and Messi, critiquing their undeclared financial agreements and their involvement in promotional campaigns for unethical regimes, respectively. He views these actions as a failure of moral courage on their part, as they have the financial security to refuse such deals without risking their lifestyle. He contrasts this with journalists like Pedro Quartango, who chose to expose corruption in football, knowing it could lead to adverse personal consequences. In his remarks, Jimenez underscores the need for widespread change, both in politics and sports, emphasizing that society deserves individuals and systems that prioritize ethics and fairness over personal gain or preservation of power. In this portion, David Jimenez talks about his experiences and perceptions related to ethics, football, culture, and the mental health crisis. He makes a compelling point about football players who accept promotional campaigns from unethical regimes. He believes this is an indication of ignorance or a disregard for the consequences of their decisions or what goes on around them. This stands in contrast to their life on the field, where everything seems bright and spectacular, hiding the grim reality beneath. David also discusses the mental health crisis, citing it as one of the world's biggest problems currently. He points out that the rate of suicide among young people has surged during the pandemic. Most alarmingly, half of these youngsters have contemplated suicide at one point or another. The media plays a role in fueling this crisis with its relentless focus on negative news. This constant bombardment of bad news, he argues, contributes to an atmosphere of fear, anxiety, and helplessness. On a critical note, David criticizes politicians' petty squabbles when pressing issues like mental health and housing need their attention. He urges them to discard their futile arguments and focus on vital, actionable steps to alleviate these problems. However, the conversation isn't entirely bleak. In David's uniquely adventurous and curiosity-driven approach, he shares an optimistic take about his latest book, The Diaries of Opium. Reflecting on his travels during the pandemic and his enduring attraction to the East, he embarks on a journey retracing the steps of great writers like Conrad, Hemingway, and Orwell. This, he believes, is his way of rekindling his past as a reporter while engaging more deeply with the allure of the East. Through this lens, he appreciates the progress and beauty in the world, juxtaposing these with the harsh realities, thus offering a more balanced view of our shared existence. In this continued conversation, David Jimenez describes some of the darker aspects of his experiences in East, particularly focusing on the prostitution industry and its deep-seated roots in the culture of some Asian countries. He tells a harrowing story, recalling his journey to the town of 11K in Cambodia, where he was exposed to the devastatingly perverse underbelly of the place. Pretending to be interested in sexual tourism, he witnessed young children being offered to tourists. The most egregious abuse happened in the so-called Pink Room, a place where young girls, some as young as 7, were exploited. In an effort to bring this dark reality to light, David took clandestine photographs and published his findings. Remarkably, he recounts returning to the same location 15 years later, only to find it had been transformed into a more righteous environment, thanks to the report he had made a decade and a half earlier that led to intervention from NGOs and foreign journalists. David doesn't shy away from confronting the darkest aspects of humanity through his work. He recounts his controversial decision to interview convicted child predators in a Cambodian prison, a choice that resulted in significant backlash from some readers and NGOs. However, he firmly believes that understanding the evils in society is necessary for their exposure, prevention, and ultimate eradication. Among these interviews was a deeply disturbing conversation with a Frenchman who confessed that he would prefer to remain in jail indefinitely since he feared the harm he would inevitably do to children if he were free again. In lighter vein, David talks about writing his latest book, The Diaries of Opium, which tells more amusing, often eccentric tales of his travels in the East. He shared an anecdote when a friend, Spanish writer Sanchez Drago, who has since passed away, offered him a marijuana-infused pizza and proposed a threesome. In his playful narrative style, David insists on the importance of unrestrained storytelling and how, despite being more reserved in conversation, He doesn't censor himself when it comes to recounting his travel adventures in writing. David Jimenez continues to paint vivid pictures of his experiences and encounters through his career in the East. In a more light-hearted chapter, he shares a peculiar incident involving his close friend, Spanish writer Sánchez Dragó. Known for his playful yet controversial character, Dragó is remembered for his charm and charismatic personality by David. Stories of Dragó's eccentricities, such as his daily routine that included taking 70 pills, drinking Johnny Walker, consuming a marijuana-infused cookie, and a dose of Cialis, portray him as a free spirit who lived life on his own terms. On a trip to Cambodia for one of Dragó's literary retreats, David faced a curious situation where he was offered a happy pizza, a Cambodian dish not known to him at that time to be laced with marijuana. His encounter with the potent meal leads to a rather humorous situation where he is propositioned for a threesome, but refuses due to his haze-filled state. This playful incident, like many others, becomes part of his storytelling arsenal in his recent book, The Diaries of Opium. Switching gears from the comic to the profound, David weaves tales about the esteemed writer Ernest Hemingway and his wife Martha Gellhorn, both of whom were known for their adventurous spirit and intense lifestyle. He discusses their unique love-hate relationship and their coverage of World War II from different angles, subtly underlining the competitive nature of their relationship. David concludes this segment by insisting that life experiences, specifically traumatic ones, are an indispensable component in the making of good writers. He argues that one can't convincingly write about betrayal, tragedy, or death without having experienced it personally. In construction of a mantra for young aspiring journalists, David firmly advises them to embrace life experiences as they provide a fertile ground for their storytelling abilities. Each one of his 6 books, he claims, is a testament to this philosophy, born out of his diverse and often challenging experiences. Geordie Wilde, in dialogue with his guest, David Jimenez, begins this section of the podcast by probing David's early career and views on war reporting. David contends that great war correspondents share an element of madness, drawn to danger, but underlying this is a profound idealism. He dismisses the idea of pursuing journalism purely for fame or money, referring to a tempting offer to appear on a popular television show, which he turned down to avoid trivializing the serious issues about corruption and the power of the press he wanted to discuss. Diving into the realm of celebrity culture, David shares his fascinating encounters with renowned figures like Jorge Javier and Terelu, hinting at the sometimes superficial community of celebrity journalism. In contrast, he also recounts depressing experiences, such as seeing the enthusiastic crowds queuing for a book signed by Belén Esteban at a book fair, while his own book, a result of 11 years of work in Afghanistan, remained largely overlooked. Later, the conversation turns to Fran de la Jungla, a character Geordie Wilde holds in high regard. David admits that he was the first to highlight Fran's work in the media before he became famous for his passionate wildlife conservation efforts. David asserts the most vital aspect of Fran's life, that his love for animals and nature is genuine, rather than engineered for television fame. David contrasts the criticism Fran sometimes faces from animal activists, emphasizing that Fran's programs promote animal protection and teach younger generations about the natural world. Despite the controversies, he remains consistent in his admiration for Fran's authenticity and his contribution to educating the public about wildlife conservation. In connection to Fran's career, David emphasizes the importance of gaining first-hand experience, both in journalism and wildlife conservation. For him, one cannot truly understand the essence of being a journalist or a conservationist without having been physically present in the field. The conversation concludes with David expressing his willingness to return to the podcast in the future, promising thrilling stories about his encounters with the Yakuza and the peculiar Professor Kun. This intriguing man, whom he met on a flight and ended up inviting home for dinner, led a fascinating life, revolving around traveling the world, reflecting an exploration-driven existence akin to David's own. Engaging further into David's tales of unique experiences, we delve into the captivating narrative of an individual referred to as Professor Kun. David explains that he met this enigmatic man on a flight and that over time they developed an intriguing connection. Professor Kun was an epitome of an exploration-driven life, similar to David's own. The professor made his fortune as the first individual to introduce Cartier jewelry in Japan and later expanded into an art trade. However, he lost his wealth significantly during the Lehman Brothers crisis. One fascinating highlight of Professor Kun's life was his extravagant lifestyle of constant travel, with suites reserved all year round in 10 different cities. This peculiar character had also been friends with Picasso and Chillida and was known for his incredible love stories. Among his narratives, he shared with David his grand, surreal vision for a resort in a small village in Bali. After building the impressive resort, Professor Kun presented it to the villagers, with the only condition being that he would always have his room there. Here, he finally found a place he could call home. David describes an intensely conveyed moment when an ailing Professor Kun nominates him as his successor to his legacy, the resort. Respectfully, David declines, stating his familial responsibilities and other commitments that make changing his life so dramatically an impossibility. Tragically, David later receives a call about Professor Kun's demise, leaving behind his unique masterpiece, a village resort named Michi. Inspired to honor his friend, David contemplates writing a book about the extraordinary life of Professor Kun, a promise he made to him during their time spent together. The stories shared by the professor, so larger than life, often make audience question their authenticity, but David testifies to their validity, emphasizing that his tales were not an exaggeration, but rather a true reflection of his fascinating life. David also cites Professor Kun's struggle in his later years, dealing with the financial difficulties of maintaining his paradise in Bali amidst a significant loss of his investment in the Lehman Brothers. The conversation ends with a heartfelt commitment from David to return for a third edition of the podcast. As he expresses gratitude to his hosts Jordi and Nacho and their listeners, he encourages them to embark on an adventure by reading The Opium Diaries. Check out the full podcast by clicking the link in the description below. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for listening to this podcast summary episode of The Pod Slice.